stand?
Whatever works for you guys
Okay.
is fine.
Okay. Good. I just want to make sure that that camera person knows
Yes.
that Lillian will be standing.
So I'm not sure, Lillian, are you able to hold the mic? Or
Yes.
you can?
When she's signing, I can.
Yeah. No.
Or Valerian can hold the mic for you. Valerian's happy.
That's what I was going to do. So you can sign and talk. I hold the mic.
Okay. When she's signing, though, I can hold the mic and help with the mic.
Whatever you
Oh.
want. I don't care. I'm just here to help.
Oh, you're just here. It's okay.
So when you want to sign and talk, right? Okay. Then you give it back to me.
Whenever I need to sign.
Sign and talk. Right?
I'm leaving. Yeah. I just want to make sure you guys are good, and then I'll get out of the way.
Good. We're just checking our shots.
Yeah.
Yeah, now you're going to sign, right? But she's going to sign for her to follow, you see? I'll be sitting.
Welcome to this press conference from the Interfaith. Oh, the mics are on? Okay. Ready to go? Thank you. Welcome to this press conference with the Interfaith Liaison Committee. We are from different faith traditions. We have been to COPs for many years now, and over at the start of the COP we also have what we call an Interfaith Talanoa dialogue, where we from the different faith-based organizations come together. We were over 100 this time to make a call to COP28, and this time we try to just give you a kind of some impression of what we have been doing and what we have been discussing at this COP. So I don't want to keep up this too long, so I will directly give the floor to Lindsay Fielder-Cook, from the representative for the human impacts of climate change from the Quaker United Nations office in Germany. Lindsay, why is just transition important at this COP? Shouldn't we pull all the efforts just to phase out the fossil fuels?
A just transition. Thank you. A just transition in this space, as an interfaith space, is a call for values and a call for conscience, a moral call to conscience. And a just transition is critical for people on the ground, but it's also critical for the international action. The Paris Agreement defines just transition as a transition of the workforce and a creation of decent work and quality jobs. But I want to highlight that there is a greater challenge on just transition going on in the COP right now, which is blocking everyone in the room. And that is a just transition on an equitable fossil fuel phase out. And the Paris Agreement asks developed countries to lead on mitigation and finance. But right now, developed countries such as my own, USA, plus the UK, Norway, Australia, Canada, those who are extractive fossil fuel economies are increasing their extraction. And a country that has actually decided to reduce and transfer their economy away from fossil fuels, which is Colombia, which has been traumatized by war, has just announced that it will join the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. That is leadership. So is leadership with Costa Rica, who is joining with Denmark and Greenland and Sweden, etc., for the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance. So when we talk about just transition, we're talking about it in the workforce to make sure that people are retrained into new and greener jobs. We're also talking about the moral call to conscience for those most wealthy on fossil fuels to equitably reduce first. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lindsay. I would like to give the word to Maua Mauro, a youth climate activist from the Lutheran World Federation from Kenya. We know loss and damage is actually a step forward at this COP, But do you think that loss and damage will be funded in time? And what are the obstacles and what are the way forward? Please, go ahead.
Thank you for that question. Bringing in the voices of the youth, from a youth perspective, and from a person coming from one of the countries in Global South, I want to raise my concern here today, specifically with the lack of the agenda of loss and damage being portrayed as an ambitious item in the global stocktake. However, we really need to bring the loss and damage agenda in the context of global stocktake as an important element that should be included in all elements that are being referred to in terms of the support and action. That is number one. But we also need to bring in the context of non-loss and damage agendas, because otherwise how would you compensate for human mobility? Disasters that are being caused by non-loss and damage agenda. We are the people of faith, we bring hope. It's the moral imperative and the moral obligation that we are addressing here. So we also need to include and mainstream these agendas in the tracks of GGA and the global stocktake in particular. And just to say with regards to finance, yesterday we heard of the Majlis. We really need to have a clear way of how we can mobilize these funds, not in terms of pledges, but rather how these funds can urgently get down to those who are affected the most. People from Global South and those that are coming from the SEEDs, small island and developing states. That is my point with regards to that. But again, GGA must provide a clear pathway, implementation tracks, and actually the support that is provisioned in accountability frameworks. Through that, we can start talking of loss and damage. Just to sum it up, a chameleon that is trying to run away from a burning bush has to forgo and sacrifice the majestic walking style of its ancestors. This earth is burning. The loss and damage has to shift from pledges to action. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I would like to give the floor to Tamsin Keriopa from New Zealand, also indigenous person in our group. Why is indigenous peoples important in climate discussions?
Thank you, and tēnā koutou katoa, e te whānau. One of the aspects of justice highlighted in our Interfaith statement to COP28, which I'm thankful for, is the importance of the implementation of the rights of Indigenous peoples. Justice for Indigenous peoples, however, is often framed in these spaces in two particular, controlled, tokenistic, and often patronising ways. Firstly, as simple inclusion and visibility of Indigenous people at the table, the already predetermined and controlled table, I might add. And secondly, the listening to the stories and cosmologies of Indigenous peoples with the stated intention of using them to inform the construction of new frameworks. However, the rights of Indigenous peoples in their various lands and countries, particularly in the West, in the Anglosphere, you might say that is, the UK, America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, my context, are generally ignored, as is the significance of the implementation of the rights of Indigenous peoples outlined in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and various local treaties. The implementation of Indigenous rights is crucial in order to decolonise and change COP agenda and outcomes, particularly in relation to mitigation and a just transition. We argue for justice not only in COP28 decisions, but also in the overall framework of COP, which is, understandably, heavily focused on emissions. But often that comes at the expense of concern for Mother Earth as a whole, including issues to do with land, plant and animal life and water, which are part and parcel for Indigenous peoples in these discussions. COP28 focused heavily on issues of finance and the implementation of Loss and Damage Fund. We need to be wary, however, both of a heavy emphasis on financial responses and the economic framing of these discussions, and the dwindling lack of consideration this leaves for mitigation, which is a central concern for Indigenous peoples. Non-financial solutions and responses are crucial, and again, the implementation of the rights of Indigenous peoples in their own countries would be a significant way forward there. In my own context, the recognition of the rights of the Whanganui River in 2017 would never have happened apart from the recognition of Māori tribal rights. So the two struggles are connected. Indigenous peoples argue for their rights not for their own sake in these spaces, but because they're intimately linked with care for Mother Earth. Justice then in these discussions and decisions for Indigenous people must begin with not only the recognition of, but the constitutional adoption and implementation of Indigenous rights in the various member countries, and I would say also here to my own Christian communities in our church structures and governance models. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tamsin. We go to Shantanu Mandal, a youth climate activist from Brahma Kumaris in India. Do you think that the next generation is included in COP discussions today? And what do you want to see in the future? Please.
Thank you so much, Henrik. Greetings of peace to everyone who is here. And yes, my answer would be, honestly, a lot has been achieved in the past COPs. I started my COP journey since 2019, and those were the days where we used to try to see us somewhere, but now we are there, but not enough. The COP presidencies since the Egypt has been appointing youth climate champion, that has been working very closely with the youth constituency of UNFCCC, that is Yango, that has facilitated many of the young peoples to really bring their voices to the table. Also, we have CDP, which is the International Youth Climate Delegate Program, which is supporting and enabling young people to learn the process and also be part of it. Even though these are very good things that have happened in the youth scenario with the UNFCCC, I would still say the amount of this should happen and the pace with which it should happen and the amount of inclusiveness that should happen is not there yet. When a small group of young people are getting facilitation and education and the enabling of their capacity to be part of these discussions, there's a huge group of young people who are outside at the grassroots who do not have this communication. So there's a big dissociation between the youth inside and the youth outside. How do we bridge that is a question that everybody needs to focus on. I would also say every leader has to understand that youth is not here to take your space. If you involve youth in your space, you will be called as a leader who is working along with the youth. The young people, when you bring them into your leadership is seen as an inclusive leadership. So this would be a call out to COP and to everyone to see this panel, where 50% of this panel is children and youth. Let's clap for that. And share this message to the world that this has to happen at every group, not just in the COP, but even in your families. Let the children and youth speak.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I would like to give the word to Elena Cedillo, who is co-chair of ACTA. No, you're not co-chair of ACTA Alliance. You are in the LWF, the Lutheran World Federation, based in Switzerland. Human rights, I mean, can you explain the necessity of, excuse for bad English, why we must have human rights in COP? We have so much else to do.
Thank you so much, Henrik. Let me begin by reminding all of us that yesterday, December 10, we celebrated the 75th anniversary of the Declaration of the Human Rights. The full and effective enjoyment of human rights is directly or indirectly affected by the impacts of climate change. What we see so far is not a strong language on human rights. Merely respecting human rights is not enough. Protecting, promoting, and fulfilling human rights must be at the heart of the climate negotiations. Leaders at the COP28 Climate Summit must place human rights at its heart by agreeing to rapidly phase out fossil fuels. Climate change is affecting disproportionately the livelihood of the poor and the most vulnerable worldwide, especially those who are often faced with different forms of discrimination and marginalization, such as women in situations of poverty, youth, children, people with disabilities, and indigenous people. The global stocktake should provide a clear guidance on the way forward for human rights to inform the national determined contributions that should be updated by 2025. We call upon COP28 to strengthen human rights language in climate agreements, establish accountability mechanisms to address human rights impacts of climate change, ensure that indigenous rights are considered and protected in the implementation of climate action. Ambitious climate action prioritizes justice and equity. There is no climate justice without human rights. Thank you, Henry.
Thank you so much. Now I would like to give the floor to Faith Sebwa. She's a 12-year-old student of class 6, hearing impaired from Kenya, but also working on climate change. Faith, you are 12 years old, and it's your future we are making decision on today. What is your message to COP, being a child, but also having a disability?
My message to COP and to you adults is that we must conserve our environment. We need a clean world, and we must accelerate the phasing out of fossil fuel. Also, the adults must understand that you are living in our world, and as children, we have the vision of the future and the world that we want to live in. You must listen to our voices, you must consider our ideas and our knowledge, which is very important. Children need to be sitting in the decision-making tables. You don't make decisions for us because we are capable. Children with disabilities as well must be in these decision-making tables. You must listen to our voices. And we want to see in COP a special component for children with disabilities to share their ideas and their voices. Thank you.
Can we do it like this? Thank you so much. Very powerful. Now you just got a kind of taste of the rich discussion. We also discuss the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. We talk about ecocide. We talk about food. So it's every day on the agenda for a faith-based organization at COP to discuss this. I open up the floor for any questions you want to put to the panelists. So please go ahead. Don't be shy. Okay. I don't see any hands. I got one hand.
Hello. I would like to hear from you. Why do you think that faith-based organizations make a difference in such a place, in such a political place?
And the question is to everyone in the panel, or and especially?
Yeah, I think anyone in the panel is able to answer that question.
Who volunteer? Sean? Yes, and then Lindsay.
Thank you so much for this question. I think whenever the world has seen any kind of crisis, whether it's an earthquake or a flood or something, it's always the faith houses or the communities that has opened their doors wide, and the first ones to bring out help to those communities. The world is not facing one earthquake or one flood at the moment. It is facing crisis, and that's why the faith communities come up with their open hearts. And we also recognize that the faith communities come with a lot of more integrity in what they say, they practice. And this is also needed in the negotiations. This is also needed in the work that is going inside the COP. So I think when faith communities participate in multilateral systems like this, like the COPs or the UNIAs or UNGAs, they bring the necessary dimension that is lost. because it's not just climate crisis, it's a spiritual crisis.
Thank you. Lindsay, please go ahead.
As you said, climate change is often phrased as a spiritual crisis, and I have found over the 10 years of working in these spaces that coming from a faith-based or values-based, indigenous peoples-based, when you bring in a values into this, you cross over the political space. This is tens of thousands of people here, probably 85% relate to some form of faith or spiritual grounding. And speaking to that speaks beyond the politics, and it speaks beyond the country boundaries, and it's desperately needed. Thank you.
Tamsin, go ahead.
I think I would say what I would also say about what an Indigenous perspective brings, that is a worldview that is often, that is actually counter. It's completely different than the normal worldview and the dominant talk points that we're hearing here, which is often based around economics. So I think it's that worldview and that counter talking point to try and keep the message coming back to that justice perspective, which we hold in common as faith communities. Thank you.
Elena, please.
I only would like to add that also when faith-based organizations, faith communities participated in this space, is what we can say that people affected are the ones who participated in this space, because most of the time our churches are the communities affected. So I think raising this voice is very important in this space.
Mao, go ahead.
Just to reiterate what my panelists have said, that the faith-based organizations are the communities. We are not a different entity and a separate entity from those who are affected the most by the calamities of climate change. But I also want to bring another aspect, a practical aspect. When implementing these accords and Paris agreements, we normally pursue the legal approaches, legally binding, and the voluntary approaches. Can someone tell me how we get to implement the voluntary approaches? They are pursued the most by the faith-based organizations in terms of instilling the moral, the hope, the faith, and the belief to proceed with care, connecting with nature and the universe. And that is why we are very important in this debate.
Thank you so much. Yes, we have a question here. You need a microphone, so.
My question is for anyone on the panel who would be willing to answer, is that many times, at least in my faith tradition and Christian tradition, there are people who intend very much to be allies with indigenous peoples or marginalized peoples, but there are challenges and sometimes barriers even within our faith traditions in the way that they operate as organizations and institutions. So I would like to ask you what you're willing to share about what messages would you say to allies within your faith traditions to help be more supportive to you so that you can be even more effective as advocates?
Yeah, Tamsin, you can go ahead.
Firstly, I would say that the first premise, the first axiom is you can't negotiate on the implementation of Indigenous rights as outlined in the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, especially in countries like where you and I are from. That is a starting point, and if that's not a starting point, I don't think you can really engage. So I would say that would be, an ally in theory would appreciate this, so that's where it should start.
I think, again, as faith communities, we need to understand that when we practice what we practice, our separate and our individual practices, that's one thing. But as a whole human community, we are from one faith or one religion, that is consumerism. We all are consumers. So if we understand this, that I am consuming from someone else's future, that will unite us in the way we think, the way we believe, the way we choose. And so that would be something that anybody from any faith community can go back and share with their community, that we are, first of all, consumers at a physical level, and at a spiritual level, we all trust, believe, need peace.
Thank Thank you. Yes, the last question here.
Thank you for your good representative. My question is direct to Mr. Maro. How you can share with the youth, like as your initiative or what you did from your position to your community? In it at least. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll be very brief. From the global negotiations, we scaled down this dialogue to the local perspective. Coming from a faith-based organization through ecumenical partnerships, and specifically I want to thank the Lutheran World Federation, an organization that I've been working the most. We've been in touch with the local communities, empowered them, build their capacity, train them, ensure that they have an access to public information. I've run a number of campaigns. We've cleaned beaches. We've planted over 3,500 seedlings in the ocean. We have empowered farmers, trying to teach them on how best to adapt to the changing climate conditions. And we've also brought the youth together, cutting across the conversation of intergenerational justice. And that is what we're doing to the community. We're working together with the youth, and I hope to do more with regards to climate action.
Thank you. We are coming up to the end of this press conference, but I would just like to give the last minute to Faith, representing the future and also our obligation to act. Please, if you want to say one last word, you're welcome.
I want to thank you all and for giving me this opportunity to participate. The question was easy for me. Thank you for making it child-friendly as well. And I want to urge you all that we please make the world a better place for the youth and for children and children with disabilities. Please let's make this world a clean and beautiful place for us to live. Children with disabilities are facing double barriers when it comes to climate change and disability, but we are always left behind when these discussions are being made. Let us look forward to a world where each child will be an equal participant. When we are talking about rescue and also recovery from things like flood, let's consider children with disabilities and not only consider them after everyone else has been taken care of. So don't forget about us, don't forget about children, and don't forget about children with disabilities, because we are also affected by climate change.
That's the best way to end this all. Thank you so much. We can applaud in whatever way we want to, so please. Thank you.